In cities all across America, there are these invisible lines. On one side, you've got opportunity, and on the other, well, you've got scarcity. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the hidden architecture that drew those lines in the first place, a force that has absolutely shaped where and how we all live.
Have you ever experienced this? You cross a single street and it feels like you've just stepped into a completely different world. One neighborhood is full of bustling shops and green parks, but the one right next door feels left behind. How does that happen? Well, the answer is way more complex and, frankly, a lot more deliberate than you might think. And this contrast, it's just stark. On one side, you have communities with well-funded schools and thriving businesses, and on the other, you have the reality of underfunded services, these so-called service deserts where you can't even find a bank, and food deserts with no fresh groceries in sight. This divide didn't just happen by accident. Nope. It's the outcome of a very specific historical process. Okay, so what is this process? The main force driving this split is something sociologists have called the Great Exodus. It really kicked off in the middle of the 20th century, and it completely reshaped the American city as we know it.
Now, this exodus has a more specific name you've probably heard: white flight. It describes the mass departure of white families from city neighborhoods as minority families started to move in. But listen, this wasn't just about changing neighbors. It was a process that actively siphoned the economic and social lifeblood right out of a community.
And what's really fascinating, and kind of scary, is the speed at which this all happened. Researchers found there was a tipping point. It's this threshold where the percentage of minority residents, sometimes as low as just 10 or 20%, would trigger this massive, rapid departure of white residents. And that one event would fundamentally, and often permanently, change the entire neighborhood. This rapid departure kicks off a truly devastating chain reaction. Think of it like a domino effect that leads to a community-wide collapse. The very first domino to fall is economic. When a huge chunk of residents leaves, the community's property tax base, the money that funds schools, police, sanitation, basically everything, it just collapses. So here's how that step-by-step decline works. First, the residents and the businesses that rely on them pack up and leave. Second, like we just saw, tax revenue absolutely plummets. Third, with less money coming in, the city has no choice but to cut public services. And finally, with worse services and the neighborhood becoming less desirable, property values for everyone who's left just collapse, wiping out family wealth. The long-term scars from this erosion are deep, and they're still visible today. Businesses close their doors, jobs vanish, grocery stores leave, creating those food deserts. Roads and parks fall into disrepair. And the result? A landscape of neglect and an intense concentration of poverty, all locked into racially segregated areas. But here's the most important question in all of this. Did this just happen? Was it all just the result of a bunch of individual choices? Well, the historical record shows that this was not an accident at all. It was, in fact, a deliberate design set in motion by official policy. So, was it all just a coincidence? Absolutely not. The evidence shows that this mass exodus wasn't just encouraged, it was engineered by a whole system of official discriminatory government policies. And the cornerstone of this whole system was a federal policy called redlining. Starting back in the 1930s, the government literally drew red lines on city maps right around minority neighborhoods and deemed them too hazardous for any investment. This made it virtually impossible for black families to get a mortgage, effectively locking them out of homeownership, the American dream. But redlining didn't act alone. It was reinforced by a whole toolkit of other practices. You had restrictive covenants, which were actual legal clauses written into property deeds that straight up forbade selling a home to black people. And then you had blockbusting. This was a predatory real estate tactic where agents would intentionally stoke racial fears to scare white homeowners into selling their homes for cheap. Then they turn around and sell those exact same homes to black families at hugely inflated prices. When you put it all together, these policies created the segregated patterns that really fueled white flight. So now let's talk about the lasting legacy of this unequal landscape.
The ultimate function of this entire system, well, it can be summarized in this one line. It was designed for the purpose of systematically stripping black communities of the economic and social capital needed to thrive.
So why does this history from decades ago still matter so much today? Because these policies didn't just affect one generation. They kicked off a vicious cycle of disadvantage. By denying access to homeownership, which is the primary way American families built wealth, they trapped entire generations in poverty and created these deep, structural barriers to upward mobility that we are still dealing with to this day.
The red lines may be gone from the maps, but their ghosts are pretty much etched into the geography of our cities.
So the next time you cross that invisible line, from a neighborhood that's thriving to one that's struggling, ask yourself, how does a history we can't see still manage to shape everything we can?